terrorize a string of gruesome deaths at the hands of a serial killer. People had their loved ones brutally murdered.
I could smell the death and the fear in the room.
A monster known only by his cryptic calling card.
The killer called himself BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them.
Now, the killer tells his own grisly story.
I went back and strangled her again, and that finally killed her at that time.
Known to his neighbors as a Boy Scout leader, a churchgoer, a family man.
He was just an ordinary guy.
But a murderer?
He absolutely terrorized the community.
Why did it take the police so long? How was serial killer Dennis Rader finally caught?
BTK is arrested.
BTK, the killer next door. These tree-lined streets of Wichita, Kansas are home to a close-knit community. The kind of place where people feel like they know their neighbors well. Or so the residents who live here thought. For on this street, in this house, a vicious serial killer lived for almost 30 years.
What he does is sick. He's demented in that regard. But in terms of his intelligence, in terms of what he has done, the way he has played this community, this police department, and the media, that's pretty well orchestrated.
For decades, former police chief Richard LeMunyon watched as the killer took victim after victim, each crime terrifyingly similar. The killer stalks his prey, breaks into homes, cuts phone lines, lies in wait, and binds his victims with duct tape or elaborate knots, torturing them until he decides to kill them.
It's clear that in each case, he had prior knowledge of these people, their activities, when they were going to be home, when they were going to be gone, as a general rule, what was happening.
A mass murderer living in their midst, totally unafraid of being caught. What's more, the killer brags about it. He sends notes, word puzzles, or souvenirs he has taken from those he's killed to the local media. Former news director Ron Lowen.
He told us that it was easy. After he killed someone, he just assumed his rightful place in the world.
The killer becomes so consumed with publicity, he even suggests the name he'd like to be known by.
The killer called himself BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them.
BTK, a man we now know to be Dennis Rader, murdered 10 people during a killing spree that started in 1974. It is a reign of terror that alters everything for this city by the banks of the Arkansas River.
Everything changed for everyone in Wichita. Things were never quite the same. You never think of a serial murder of that dimension with that sort of cunning and motivation being among us.
For years, Wichita's citizens are terrified of BTK.
It was on our minds at all times. BTK was always a subject that come up at any table.
But I can definitely remember stories of everyone being frightened, especially the ones with, single moms with young children coming home.
Fear of a monster among them has people in Wichita learning karate, buying guns, and beefing up security systems.
I'm just real nervous about it now. And now you're gonna really, I'm gonna be watching every move I make now, because that just scares me half to death.
But finally, after 30 years, a break in the case.
BTK is arrested.
At an emotional press conference on February 26, 2005, investigators announced the news to journalists and victims' families. Wichita's long nightmare may be over.
Yesterday afternoon, agents from the KBI, agents from the FBI, and members of the Wichita Police Department arrested Dennis Rader.
The police have arrested a man who has been living right out in the open the entire time. It is exactly what Lowen predicted months before there was an arrest.
A number of people who were really truly involved in the investigation have a sense that this guy, he's really the stranger beside you.
Dennis Rader isn't just any member of the community. He is a city compliance officer charged with enforcing minor local ordinances.
The dogs are somewhat territorial as well as vicious, and we've been trying to round them up and corral them as best we can.
Rader is a trusted neighbor.
said the nicest guy in the world. I would have probably gave him the key to wash my dog if I had to when I was leaving town.
He was a leader of the local scout troop.
He was a good leader. He was good with the boys. Used to go on campouts with him.
He is even the president of his church.
He does whatever membership in the churches do. He will be an usher. He will run the sound system. He'll count the money after the service. If something needs to be done, Dennis was always available to help.
Even those who may not like Rader can't believe what he is accused of.
He wasn't a pleasant person, but we would have never thought a killer, you know, or anything like that.
Indeed, through most of his life, Dennis Rader is a fixture in the Wichita community.
He really was amongst us. I didn't personally know him, but I've saw him before.
It seems few ever suspected Rader could have a dark side, that it was even conceivable that he could be a serial killer. People who worked with him for years can't believe Dennis Rader has been arrested for the BTK murders.
You would not assume by meeting him back in the 70s or the 80s that he would be this type of a person.
But longtime acquaintance Dee Stewart says Rader was harsh with her close friend, a woman who worked under Rader in the compliance department.
He could be berating her, he could be screaming at her, and if the phone rang and it was a member of his family, he turned into Ward Cleaver.
That Dennis Rader could be both a mild-mannered father figure and a vicious serial killer confounds the pastor at the church Rader and his wife of 34 years attended every Sunday.
I'm bewildered, confused, trying to make sense of it all, and also trying to find the gospel in all of this craziness.
Rader's arrest marks a bittersweet moment for family members of the victims, especially Charlie Otero. His family was the first victimized by BTK. Charlie came home after school to find his parents and two of his siblings murdered, their bodies spread throughout the house.
My father was tied up. His eyes were bulging, his tongue was about bit off. My mother was on the bed. She didn't even look like my mother. And I looked at my dad, and I could smell the death and the fear in the room.
It is Charlie's story where the nightmare begins more than 3 decades ago, when Dennis Rader started his gruesome rampage, and the Otero family became his first target.
I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take.
And for the first time comes the description of this act and the other horrible crimes in the killer's own words.
I put a plastic bag over his head and then some cords and tightened it.
It all starts here more than 30 years ago, 803 North Edgemore Street in Wichita, Kansas, the home of Joseph and Julie Otero and their 5 children. It is January 15th, 1974, around 1 p.m. Charlie Otero, then 15, comes home early from school.
And I walked into the backyard and I noticed my dog outside in the snow, Lucky. He was never outside, he was never left outside, so right away I started thinking something was, not quite right.
The house is quiet, the kitchen in disarray.
And I yelled out, "Is anybody home?"
Otero's little sister and brother had arrived home before him. Now they cry out,
"Charlie, come quick. Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." I ran through the hallway down to the bedroom, and I found my brother with my parents.
These police sketches show the horror Charlie encounters. Upstairs, his parents strangled, hands and feet bound. His 9-year-old brother lying dead at the foot of the bed, apparently suffocated. The killer has tied a hood over his head.
Had you planned this beforehand?
To some degree, yes.
How did you get into the house?
I came through the back door, cut the phone lines, waited at the back door.
This is 60-year-old Dennis Rader pleading guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Greg Waller leads Rader step by step through the killings.
What did you do to Joseph Otero?
I put a plastic bag over his head and then some cords and then tightened it.
Did he, in fact, suffocate and die as a result of this?
Not right away. No, sir, he didn't.
Rader finally makes sure the gruesome task is done.
I think I put either a cloth or a T-shirt or something over his head, and then a bag, another bag, and then tightened it down.
Did he subsequently die?
Well, yes.
Rader then strangles Mrs. Otero, her son, and then takes 11-year-old Josephine down to the basement and hangs her from a pipe.
Did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies, but that was after she was hung.
Police find traces of semen at the crime scene. For Charlie Otero, the shock of seeing his slaughtered family is shattering.
I lost my religion instantly. The minute I saw my mother, I said, there cannot be a God. Not only can there not be a God, but I hate him if he is a God.
The police don't think robbery is a motive, even though Joseph Otero's watch is missing.
I think I took Mr. Otero's watch. I guess I took a radio. I'd forgot about that, but apparently I took a radio.
Why did you take these things?
I don't know. I have no idea.
This detail and many others about the Otero killings are not released to the public. Nothing like this has ever happened before in Wichita.
Most of the homicides that we experienced in this town were like any other homicides, but to have something premeditated, obviously planned, it was very shocking to the community.
At this point in the early 70s, Dennis Rader begins to establish what appears to be an ordinary life. He takes a job at a local factory. He marries, moves into this house, and has 2 children. Meanwhile, BTK's murdering spree is just getting started.
Most people who study serial killers will suggest that once they start, they don't stop.
Clint Van Zandt is a former criminal profiler for the FBI.
Their drug of choice is murder. It's a drug they enjoy, that they need another hit from occasionally.
In April of 1974, 21-year-old Catherine Bright is coming home with her 19-year-old brother, Kevin. Dennis Rader is waiting for them inside with a gun.
I tied his feet to the bedpost, on the bedpost so he couldn't run. Kind of tied her in the other bedroom, and then I came back to strangle him. And at that time, we had a fight.
Kevin Bright, now 50, remembers the confrontation.
I broke loose and you know, fought him, and then I was shot.
And I pulled my gun and quickly shot him. I hit him in the head. He fell over. I could see the blood.
I just went to the floor and acted like I was dead.
Kevin can hear the voice of his sister talking to the killer in the next room.
Started to strangle Catherine. And then we started fighting, and I got the best of her, and I thought she was going down, and then I could hear some movement in the other room. So I went back, and
then he started strangling me again, and I struggled again and was shot again.
And I used the .22 and shot him one more time, and I thought he was down for good that time.
Kevin manages to escape.
Out and got out the door and went for help.
But not in time to save his sister.
You say you used a knife on her.
Yes.
What did you do with the knife?
I stabbed her. She said either stabbed 2 or 3 times, either here or here.
Catherine dies a few hours later. Kevin gives his description of the killer to the police.
He was able to give us somewhat of a description in that it was a white male, probably in his 30s. But short of that, it really was not a very good description, and in defense of him, he just couldn't remember because of the head injury and the trauma that he had gone through.
At the time, police do not link this killing with the Otero murders. That, along with the lack of publicity, makes the killer angry. In October 1974, 9 months after the Otero murder, the killer makes his first contact.
He wrote a letter, and he put it in a book in the city library downtown.
A reporter for the Wichita Sun gets a mysterious phone call telling him to check out an engineering textbook from the local library. In it, the reporter finds a letter from someone claiming credit for the Otero murders. The letter offers information that only the police know: the position of the bodies, what they were tied with, how they died. It is filled with poor grammar and spelling mistakes. The killer seems upset that the police have other suspects in the murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself and with no one's help. The killer writes that a monster has entered his brain and that he can't stop it, that he is under the monster's control. He has already chosen his next victim, he writes. Good luck hunting, and and he signs it yours truly, guiltily. In the postscript, he gives himself a name. The code word for me, he writes, will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. This letter is the first of many. Police begin to suspect they have a serial killer in the community, hiding in plain sight. And Dennis Rader does have all the trappings of a very normal life. Now, as a supervisor for a security company, he has access to people's homes. He is an active member of the Christ Lutheran Church. Paul Karlstedt worked and attended church with Rader during this period and remembers a man who kept his commitments.
I was over at church about 5 o'clock getting ready for the spaghetti supper we were going to have, and Dennis walked in and he was carrying a crock pot, and he said, look, he said, Paula and I may not be able to be at the service tonight, but we signed up to bring spaghetti sauce and a salad. He said, so I've brought it.
Dennis Rader, he says, the reliable church-going family man.
That's the Dennis that I know, Dennis that signed up for something and would follow through.
But that Dennis Rader has a secret and terrible identity. For 3 years after the first killings, the police worked the case with no breaks. Then, in March 1977, 26-year-old Shirley Vianne, a mother of 3, is found strangled on her bed. Her hands and feet are bound, and a cord is wrapped around her neck.
And she got sick, threw up, got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then I went ahead and tied her up, and then put a bag over her head and strangled her.
8 months later, another gruesome murder. This time, BTK is brash enough to make a phone call,
telling us that there's a homicide at a specific location.
You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
Police find 25-year-old Nancy Jo Fox dead in her bedroom, a nylon stocking twisted around her neck.
Had you had sexual relations with her?
No. I told her I was, but I did not.
Instead, after she is dead, he leaves semen at the scene. And as a souvenir, he takes Fox's driver's license, just as he took Joseph Otero's watch. There are now 7 murder victims in 4 years, but the general public still does not know the crimes are related. BTK is unknown outside a few journalists and the police. That would soon change. BTK has more letters to write and more victims to bind, torture, and kill.
That was part of my, I guess my what you call fantasy.
By late 1977, BTK's 4-year reign of terror has ended the lives of 7 residents of Wichita, Kansas. The crime scenes are filled with clues to the killer's pattern. Phone lines cut, victims bound and strangled, cords tied around the victim's neck with complicated knots. BTK takes personal items from his victims like watches or driver's licenses, but he never leaves fingerprints.
Art, are you pleading guilty because you are guilty?
Yes, sir.
As he pleads guilty to the BTK killings, Dennis Rader says he strangled for sexual enjoyment.
That was part of my, I guess my what you call fantasy.
He would take a young girl and the younger women later on and strangle them to the point of almost death, and then that's how he was, getting his relief, so to speak, and that he was leaving semen behind as a result of that.
In fact, at almost every crime scene, police find traces of semen. But since these murders occur before DNA testing, it is of little use in identifying the killer. And BTK savors the moment of the kill long after it's over.
She was already dead, so I took pictures of her in different forms of bondage.
There is a belief that he may have used a tape recorder while he was killing the people so that he could experience over and over the thrill that he had.
Ron Lowen ran the newsroom at KAKE-TV in Wichita in the 70s. In February of 1978, a little more than 2 months after the 7th killing, a letter arrives at the television station. Its contents still disturb Lowen to this day.
There was no doubt in my mind that it was from BTK. When I sat in my office and read his account of what he had done, and I wasn't ready for that.
Like BTK's first letter, this one is filled with lurid details only the killer could have known. 2 single-spaced pages ranting that he is forced to kill by Factor X, which he claims motivated Son of Sam in New York, Jack the Ripper in London, and the Hillside Strangler in Los Angeles. It seems senseless, but we cannot help it, BTK writes. There is no help, no cure except death or being caught and put away.
He was making it clear that he wanted to be elevated to the Serial Killer Hall of Fame. This is the league that he said he should be in.
In court, Dennis Rader even gives a lecture to the judge about serial killers.
If you read much about serial killers, they go through what they call the different phases. That's one of the phases they go through as a trolling stage. Basically, you're looking for a victim at that time.
To this point, the residents of Wichita have not been told about the earlier letters or that all the murders are connected.
That was information that the police did not release. And they did it because they didn't want to fuel BTK.
In his letter, Dennis Rader lets the police know he's upset by the lack of publicity. A little paragraph would have been enough, he writes. How many people do I have to kill until I get my name in the paper? Even more chilling, BTK makes it clear he has already targeted victim number 8.
It was haunting. In telling us that he was stalking someone now, that he picked his victim, he indicated how he was going to kill that person. And then the last sentence was, maybe it's you.
Now, with this letter, 7 victims and the prospect of an 8th, police think they have no choice but to tell the public what they know and let BTK have his day in the sun.
At that point, we need to step up and say, yes, we recognize you as BTK, and we do have a serial killer here.
So Police Chief Richard Lemunyan and News Director Ron Lowen appear on TV in February 1978, side by side.
BTK claims to have strangled a total of 7 women, 7 people rather, mostly women.
The police said, I guess based again on their talk with their behavioral people, that this is a cry for help. This guy has more that he wants to say. We'd suggest that you do the story so that it has a face with it, someone that he might choose to communicate with again.
What kind of leads do you have?
The news itself sends shockwaves through Wichita.
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all.
It was horrific news. Everything changed for me, and everything changed for everyone in Wichita.
The effect of the bombshell announcement is instantaneous.
Everyone believes they could be next, you know, and you've got a town of 400,000 people. You have to give assurance, you know, that you're doing, number 1, everything you can possibly do, and number 2, try to put the danger really back. This person isn't everywhere.
But most people are terrified. The fear is palpable, and no one feels it more than Ron Lowen himself, who goes from covering the news to being at the center of it.
It was a crazy time. The police looked after me. They checked my apartment out every night when I went in, and they followed me in my car, which after a while became so nerve-wracking for me. After a number of weeks, I just asked them to stop doing that.
Hoping BTK would contact him, the police bring Lowen inside the investigation. Lowen is given a photo of a possible suspect and a police revolver.
That gun creeped me out. It was the tangible reminder that there was a killer out there, and that at some level the police thought that he might be coming to see me.
BTK has someone else in mind to be his 8th victim. On a late April evening in 1979, the killer breaks into the home of a 63-year-old woman and waits for her to arrive.
He was waiting on her. That particular evening, she didn't return home. She went, as I recall, and spent the night with a relative.
The decision not to go home that night saves the woman's life. 6 weeks later, the woman gets a letter from BTK, letting her know how close she came to death.
He sent a communication describing to her what he was going to do.
The letter is chilling, not only to his intended victim, but to the entire community. In a city where the killer could be anywhere, BTK wants everyone to fear anyone could be next.
They used a ruse as a telephone repairman to get in their house.
It is 1979. It has been more than a year since police released a letter written by a killer who calls himself BTK. Wichita, Kansas is a town gripped by fear, living with the knowledge that a serial killer is on the loose.
He absolutely terrorized the community. Everyone was a suspect. Girlfriends were concerned about their boyfriends. There were parents who turned in their children. The fear was palpable.
But just north of town, on this quiet street in suburbia, domestic tranquility reigns. Dennis Rader and his wife Paula have settled into this house. They would send their 2 children to the local school. Paul Karlstedt has known Dennis Rader for 30 years. He says it never occurred to anyone at the Christ Lutheran Church that the young family man passing the collection plate on Sunday mornings is also Wichita's worst nightmare.
We have prayed for an outcome in the BTK case. I can't remember specifics, but we ask for prayers on Sunday morning.
With the community praying for an end to the terror, the killer suddenly goes silent. No more letters to the media, no more taunting the cops. As the years passed and those intimately involved in the investigation moved on, the mystery of who BTK was and what might have happened to him only deepened.
I thought he died because I bought into the Factor X thing, and that I believed that if he was alive and had the ability, he'd keep killing. And if he wasn't, he'd left town or he was dead.
Then, on September 16th, 1986, 7 years after the last known BTK crime, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerly is found strangled in her home.
I used Ruth as a telephone repairman to get in their house, and after I tied her hands, she broke that and we started fighting. And we fought quite a bit, back and forth.
All right, she was physically fighting you?
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
What happened then?
Finally got the hand on her and got a nylon sock and started strangling.
Her 2-year-old child is unharmed. Her car found 2 blocks away, but her driver's license is missing. Though investigators find semen at the scene and immediately suspect BTK, they keep their suspicions to themselves.
Do you panic the city again? You know, what do you do? The decision was made at that point that we don't do anything. We'll investigate it as if it was connected, but we are not going to admit anything at this point. The thought being, well, if it is, he's going to let us know. We never heard from him.
At the time of Wegerly's murder, Dennis Rader, the devoted dad, volunteers to help lead a Cub Scout troop, enthusiastically helping young boys learn the art of tying knots.
I think he was proud of being a scout leader. Ever since I signed him up, he was always available. It seemed like every time we had a function, he was there.
If nothing else, Dennis Rader is reliable. At the security company, where he has worked for more than 10 years, Rader is known as a no-nonsense supervisor who will not tolerate slipshod workmanship.
Some of the installers would say that he could possibly be kind of crass with them because if they didn't install something the way he wanted them to be installed, if there was any kind of wire showing, he was very oriented to details.
It's an orientation that is perfect for Dennis Rader's next career. In 1989, Rader leaves the security company to become a compliance officer and moonlight as a census taker in a nearby suburb. He's in charge of enforcing municipal details, from sign placement to the acceptable height of lawn grass. As the federal census supervisor, Rader has the tedious task of checking and rechecking every name and address in the Wichita area in preparation for the 1990 census. Mind-numbing work, perhaps, but both jobs give Dennis Rader a small measure of power and publicity, like when he was interviewed about a problem with stray dogs. By 1991, Dennis Rader has an almost encyclopedic knowledge of his community. If there is a woman living alone, he knows where she is. If the home has a security alarm or a guard dog, he may know that, too. At the time, the strangling death of 62-year-old Dolores Davis in January 1991 seemed like just another senseless, isolated murder. But it is a BTK crime.
What did you strangle her with?
Pantyhose.
Veteran detectives didn't make the connection, though they still remembered BTK. But since he had not contacted anyone in 12 years, most assumed he was either dead, institutionalized, or somebody else's problem.
The police speculated that maybe he was in jail, and the investigation wound down.
In fact, the BTK trail went so cold that in early 2004, the local newspaper decided to take a retrospective look at the 30th anniversary of BTK's first murders.
And that story ran in January, which prompted, I think some of the TV stations did 30th anniversary stories too.
Those stories recounted the depravity of the crimes and the panicked paranoia of the times. For many in Wichita, the whole sordid story brought back bad memories. For those new to the area, they served as an introduction to a local legend, Wichita's own serial killer.
I got a flurry of calls and emails from people who remembered, maybe some tips. It was a talked about story.
Then, on March 19th, a strange envelope arrives at the newsroom. The name on the return address, Bill Thomas Kilman, the initials BTK. The writer had something he wanted to say.
I handcuffed her, had her lay on the bed, and then I tied her feet.
Okay, you're not gonna believe this.
People are reluctant to think that you could come upon the Jesus.
It is 2004, and life in Wichita, Kansas has long since returned to normal. The fear that once gripped the town is gone. 30 years have passed since Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, strangled his first victims. 25 since he last taunted police.
The police thought that he perhaps was dead, perhaps he moved away, maybe he was in jail for some other crime.
The horrible crimes that held Wichita under siege during the 1970s are now the stuff of legend, with only an occasional mention on the news. Tim Rogers is an assistant managing editor at the Wichita Eagle.
Longtime Wichitans knew the name, but, you know, it was something maybe in the back of their memories.
But all of that is about to change. The 30th anniversary of the killings prompts local news media to run stories about the city's most notorious cold case and how Wichita has recovered from its painful history.
I think everyone who's worked on the case at the police department thought they'd never hear from the guy again.
Reporter Hearst Laviana is the first to realize the police are wrong and that history is about to repeat itself. Laviana writes the local paper's anniversary piece on BTK. 3 months after it runs, Laviana gets a strange letter in the mail.
There's nothing to read. There are no words on it. I thought it was crime scene photographs that some crackpot had gotten a hold of on the internet or something. And the pictures appeared to be pictures of a dead woman who's lying on the floor, and her clothing was arranged in different ways in each of the pictures.
They are not police photos, and something else in the envelope gives the reporter a cold chill.
I noticed that part of that photocopy was Vicki Wegerle's driver's license, and I immediately knew this probably came from Vicki Wegerle's killer.
Vicki Wegerle was murdered in September of 1986. She was found in her home, bound and strangled, her driver's license stolen. The crime had all the markings of a BTK murder, except one. The killer had never boasted about it, as he had with his victims from the 70s.
After she was down and not moving anymore, I rearranged her clothes a little bit and took some quick photos, I think 3 of them, if I remember.
Now, almost 20 years after the mother of 2 was murdered, Hearst Laviana is holding an envelope that links Wegerle's death to a ghost from Wichita's past.
The return address said Bill Thomas Kilman, BTK. And that's when we realized this may be the real deal.
BTK hasn't moved away, hasn't died, hasn't stopped watching the papers for news about his crimes. Laviana is now writing a story he thought he'd never report.
It was a very straightforward story. BTK is back and claims to have killed an 8th victim. I don't know how many extra newspapers they sold the next day, but I'm sure it was more than a few.
BTK is once again headline news in Wichita.
I was in a blissful, serene, wonderful place, and the fact that he's alive took me back to that day and those days afterwards when it was cold and people were afraid and nobody knew what would happen next.
The story that the killer is still alive stays on people's minds for months. And then another envelope appears.
It was just before noon on Wednesday when a letter arrived at our studios.
In May of 2004, a suspicious letter arrives at KAKE-TV. Like the other letters, it too bears a name containing a variation of the initials BTK. And like the other letters, the return address is a fake. But this letter is different. It is titled Chapter 8 and contains a word search puzzle. It may be the most brazen clue to the former dog catcher's identity as BTK. More than 40 words are found hidden in the puzzle, including help, lost pet, my DNA, and even letters that spell out D. Rader.
He felt tremendously superior, arrogant. Serial killers, if they want to get caught, they could just call the police themselves. They enjoy outfoxing the police. They feel that they're uncatchable, invincible.
After the puzzle, the clues keep coming. In December, an eerie package is found in Wichita's Murdoch Park. Inside, a doll with a bag over its head, and a copy of the driver's license of Nancy Fox, one of BTK's victims from the 70s. Dennis Rader remembers her too.
She was a little upset. We talked for a while. She smoked a cigarette. I handcuffed her, had her lay on the bed, and then I tied her feet. And then I was also undressed to a certain degree. And then I got on top of her, and then I took the belt and then strangled her with the belt at that time.
Once again, the killer who craved attention is getting it. He is in every newspaper, on every local newscast, and is even featured on the national television show America's Most Wanted.
Our next story is about a serial killer you may not have heard about.
I've always thought that, he had the misfortune, given his aspirations, to live in a small media market. He never got the attention because he lived in Wichita. If he'd done any of this in Los Angeles, it'd been a different story.
The small town of Wichita is again gripped in fear. Neighbors are once again double bolting their doors, arming themselves, and suspecting each other. But this time, police have new crime-fighting technology that wasn't around when BTK first started his terror. Seemingly, BTK's own arrogance and sense of invincibility will lead to a long-awaited break in the case. It is late in 2004. For several months, Dennis Rader has again been terrorizing the people of Wichita with a new series of letters, clues, and taunts. The latest communication is sent to Wichita's Fox TV station. Inside the package is a necklace, a photocopy of a book cover, and a computer disk. The disk is filled with more taunts and puzzles, but it contains something else, which apparently leads police to Dennis Rader.
Every computer, I guess, leaves a signature or an imprint or whatever you want to call it.
Apparently hidden deep within the disk's data is an electronic address, which points investigators to a computer at Rader's church, a computer he has allegedly used recently.
That it seems to be one of the key things that we know ties the BTK investigation to Rader.
BTK's brazen belief that he is smarter than police and his need for attention may have led investigators directly to him. It is a mistake so egregious, some wonder if Dennis Rader is in fact BTK, whether he may have intentionally given the police what they needed to catch him. Former FBI profiler Clint Van Zandt doesn't think so.
I don't know that he wanted to get caught. He felt he was so much brighter than everybody else. In his mind, he probably thought no matter what we did, we'd never figure out who he was.
The bottom line, BTK is arrested.
lot of people have told us, wow, it's just not what we thought.
I watched his children grow up. I watched Dennis nurture them and show them, and I feel that he was a good father.
Fellow church member Paul Karlstedt still can't make sense of it. How could the man he knows be BTK, who bound, tortured, and killed his victims?
I looked at the pictures in the paper Sunday morning, and there was a large picture of Dennis on the front. And then to the right of that, there was a smaller picture of Dennis in a jumpsuit. I can't superimpose the one against the other. The Dennis that I know was the big picture. The Dennis that I don't know is the one in the orange jumpsuit.
But Van Zandt says if Dennis Rader is BTK, he isn't surprised by the apparent contradictions.
He likes his secret identity. This is the type of person who was able to wear the mask of authority, the mask of a good citizen, and he did all of that very successfully.
And the pastor at Rader's church, Michael Clark, is also still incredulous that the police searched the premises for evidence that the church president is a serial killer.
It took me about 5 minutes to even understand what the detective was saying to me the day he brought the search warrant in. I had to ask him 3 times in a matter of about 45 minutes.
Now, with his public confession, Dennis Rader gives an alarming look inside the mind of a serial killer.
I went to this house, knocked on the door, and told him I was a private detective.
It's a place where future victims are projects.
Now you call these projects, were these sexual fantasies also?
Potential hits. Yeah, in my world, that's what I call them.
So you went
projects, hits.
All right, and why did you have these potential hits? Was this to gratify some sexual interest? Or?
Yes, sir. I had a lot of them, so it's just, if one didn't work out, I just moved to another one.
But authorities say for serial killers like Dennis Rader, confessing is less about making amends and more about keeping control.
He's in jail. He's not going to hurt anyone else, but he's still playing games.
For some victims' families, it will never be over.
Do you feel like you finally got some closure?
Nope.
For Charlie Otero, who lost his mother, father, brother, and sister, there are mixed feelings.
Catching him is a bittersweet victory in that I've only got half of the answers that I have always had. One is who, and the second is why.
Dennis Rader gave his answers in court, that the murders were driven by sexual fantasy, and many of the victims picked at random.